We'll start the story here with the anthrax. As you probably remember, after September 11th, there was an anthrax attack on the United States. People were killed. It put the nation in a panic. Terror alerts were issued, color-coded, and the anthrax came with a message from Al-Qaeda, allegedly. And the message branded together the United States and Israel by saying death to America and death to Israel. Well, as you've just seen from the History Channel, the anthrax strain was traced back right to our own weapons labs and facilities from the Pentagon. The person, in all likelihood, responsible for the anthrax attack was Dr. Philip Zach. He was caught on tape by the surveillance camera in Fort Detrick, Maryland, stealing the exact same strain of anthrax from the lab. Dr. Philip Zach had previously been fired from this establishment for his racist antics to an Egyptian co-worker. He is a hardline Zionist, and the anthrax that was stolen came from that lab. We have a person in that lab stealing the anthrax on tape who is a Zionist, and of course it was linked to Israel. So it's exactly what they would say. On the same day as 9/11, we also had this false story of the dancing Palestinians. The Israeli Ministry of Defense concocted this tape showing Palestinians dancing around in the streets. Supposedly, this was because they were happy about the attacks of 9/11, which they had seen on TV. However, this turned out to be a farce. The Palestinians who were filmed were dancing around because the Israeli soldiers had given them water and food. Yet it made it on every single mass media channel without any screening. It was presented as the truth and never retracted and never explained. However, a story that did not make the mass media was that of the dancing Israelis who were caught on 9/11 filming the event. They had over $5,000 stuffed in a sock. They were driving around in a white van that had a hit from the bomb-sniffing dogs. They were arrested by police and detained. They had overstayed their passports. They worked for the Israeli Mossad, and they worked in a front company called Urban Moving Systems. I'm going to go over that story in 9/11 later. But it's interesting that the dancing Israelis were not on the news, and the computers that they confiscated were classified. Yet Palestinians who were dancing were on the news. So right away, with the anthrax note and the story of the dancing Palestinian, which was already prepackaged and sent to all the mass media outlets, this story was buried. And then on top of that, some disinformation came out on the web claiming that 4,000 Jews didn't show up for work on the morning of September 11th. This is the classic tactic of Israel to associate itself with Jews in general. It was a monstrous lie, and it was started by the Jerusalem Post, a paper of Hollinger Inc., whose board of directors includes Henry Kissinger and Richard Pearl. This was a complete myth, but the 4,000 Jews rumor was spread by anti-Semitic sites and dim-witted fools who didn't bother to investigate. However, that ridiculous fake story in no way has anything to do with the dancing Israelis. The Israeli Mossad was caught celebrating the attacks of September 11th. That's a fact. And we'll get into that story later, as well as more of the disinformation. Now, the anthrax attack would be the beginning of how they started to link Al-Qaeda to Iraq, and thus Iraq to 9/11. As you just saw, Colin Powell read a speech to the UN like a sucker, which tarnished his entire career, claiming that Iraq had mobile weapons labs and could create the anthrax that had been sent to the United States, alluding to maybe Iraq was the ones who sent the anthrax. This mobile weapons lab myth was again supported by Judith Miller of the New York Times. The speech that Colin Powell read was originally written by Louis Libby, Cheney's chief of staff. He threw out that speech and went over with George Tenet and wrote another one, but it contained the same lies that Libby had written. At the same time, Al-Qaeda was being attached through Mohammed Atta, alleged hijacker, to Iraq, with this monstrous lie claiming that Mohammed Atta met with Iraqi officials in Prague, thus linking Al-Qaeda to Iraq. This story was supported by William Safire of the New York Times. It was in the press in the UK. It was supported by Gary Schmidt and Dick Cheney, of course. Libby was Cheney's chief of staff. Safire of the New York Times, as well as Miller, acted as the journalistic moles for the Pentagon. The Office of Special Plans told the INC what to say, then the journalists used those anonymous Iraqis as sources for the stories that had actually been written by Robert Kagan in the PNAT group a long time prior. And then the Pentagon quoted the journalists as sources for their stories, and it all ended up on the mainstream media. Judith Miller also made up the whopper about chemical labs being underneath the palaces of Saddam, which had also been written by Robert Kagan, and the myth of aluminum tubes acting as centrifuges for a nuclear bomb, which would not physically work anyway, but this myth supported the idea of nukes. "We can't let the smoking gun be a mushroom cloud," said Condoleezza Rice with Tim Russert. Now Judith Miller and Libby are an interesting little secret couple. Libby, of course, leaked the information about Valerie Plame, a clandestine CIA agent. One of the people he leaked it to was Judith Miller. He's his go-to girl. Another was Tim Russert of NBC, who Rice spoke with. And another leaker in this case was Robert Novak of CNN. He got his information from Karl Rove. I have Jeff Gannon written up there too, because Jeff Gannon, who worked for Talon News, created by Karl Rove, made references about internal government memos about the Plame affair before it was public knowledge. So how did this fake journalist and male hooker have access to that information before anyone else? This means he had the highest access in the White House available. Valerie Plame was part of the CIA. Her front company was Brewster Jennings and Associates. Valerie Plame and all her agents used this front company. When Libby blew Plame's cover, her team's ability to track nuclear weapons was destroyed. Her husband was Joe Wilson. He debunked a myth about the Niger forgeries. The Niger claims were connected with this myth to try and scare the American public into believing that Iraq was building a nuclear bomb or already had one. What they said was that Saddam Hussein was acquiring nuclear material or yellowcake uranium from the country of Niger. This was an outrageous lie because the foreign minister of Niger, whose name they signed on the documents to support this claim, was the wrong person. They used a foreign minister who had not been in power since 1989. So not only was it a crude forgery, it didn't even have the right person's name on it. The forgers of this document were Michael Ledeen and Larry Franklin. Michael Ledeen, of course, with his buddy Ghorbanifar, was also involved in the Iran-Contra scandal. Now Larry Franklin was a mid-level guy in the Pentagon working for the office of Douglas Feith.